which VR mode should I use when I'm using my Nikon 200 to 500 with my Nikon Z6 II, whether it's handheld, on a monopod, or on a tripod. Today, we will discuss this. VR is a very contentious issue when it comes to wildlife photography and when it comes to using VR. Should I use VR? Should I use VR in normal mode? Or should I use VR in sports mode? Now let me be clear, we're talking about using VR or not using VR on the Nikon 200 to 500 with the Z6 II. This information relates to the Z6 II when I'm using the Nikon 200 to 500. What is VR? VR is vibration reduction, and the common perception in bird photography, wildlife photography, is that once we get over 1/500th of a second, we're told that we shouldn't need VR, that if we're using VR, our image starts degrading, especially if we start climbing to, let's say, 1,200th of a second or even 1,400th of a second, that we're going to get slightly softer images, or we're going to get less images per second. If you've got a very fast camera, like if you're shooting 10 frames per second, maybe you're only going to get 8.5 frames per second instead of that 10 frames. For me, that is a non-issue, because the Nikon Z6 II, unless I'm using extended continuous focusing, which I can get up to 14 frames per second, I'm stuck at 5.5 frames per second. And this is why I say this is very relevant to the Z6 II, even the Z7 II, okay? So if we're hand holding, we're told we shouldn't be using VR, especially if we're over 1,000th of a second. Today, I'm going to disprove this by my own test. Now, be free to comment if your experience is different to mine, but I will show you some examples. I did 3 tests on the tripod without VR, on the tripod with VR in normal mode, and on the tripod with VR in sports mode. Then I did the exact same test hand holding, no VR, VR normal, VR sports. And the 3 shutter speeds I used were 1/500th of a second, 1,250th of a second, and 1/4000th of a second. For the sake and duration of this video, I'm not going to show you all the photos. In the description below, I will put a link to zip files for all the photos that were taken handheld, all the photos that were taken on a tripod. Today, on the video, I will just show you 10 photos taken at 500th of a second and 10 photos taken at 4,000th of a second in all the different modes. And at the end, I will compare the photos for you. What a lot of people state is that a photo taken without VR at 4,000ths of a second will be sharper than a photo taken at 1/500th of a second. I have not found that, and I will show you. So now let's take a look at these samples. The following set of images were taken with the camera and lens on my tripod. These first 10 set of images were taken at 1/500th of a second with VR switched off. There is just a slight movement, that is because I'm holding the camera as this is how I normally use it out in the field. The following 10 images were taken at 1/4000th of a second with VR switched off. These next 10 images were taken at 1/500th of a second with VR switched to normal. You can see that VR is active now, just slightly, but it's holding on much better than with it off. These next 10 images were taken at 1/4000th of a second with VR switched to normal. And there is barely a difference between 1/500th of a second and 1/4000th of a second. These next 10 images were taken at 1/500th of a second with VR switched to the sports mode. And this is the mode that I normally use because I find with my shaking hands I get the best outcome. These next 10 images were taken at 1/4000th of a second with VR also switched to the sports mode. Now the following set of images were taken handheld, and I rarely hand hold my camera now due to my shaking hands. So you'll see why now I don't hand hold this camera, even with VR switched on. So this first set of images, 1/500th of a second, VR switched off. You can see it, it's just jumping around everywhere. These next 10 images were taken at 1/4000th of a second with VR still switched off. These next 10 images now were taken at 1/500th of a second with VR switched to the normal mode. And you can see that even with VR at normal, it's still moving around quite a bit, but that's just me. Very hard to stay it in one position. These following 10 images, 1/4000th of a second, VR still set to normal. These next 10 images, 1/500th of a second, VR switched to the sports mode. And you can see that the sports mode is doing a much better job than the normal mode at keeping it in the center. These last 10 images were taken at 1/4000th of a second, VR switched still at sports mode. You may not be aware that the Nikon 200-500mm f5.6 lens is tripod aware. Now you might ask, what is tripod aware? Tripod aware means that when you put the lens on a tripod, it detects that it's on the tripod. So the VR will still work, but it won't work as actively. If I've got my VR set in sports mode, which is the strongest VR mode possible, where it stops all the shaking up, down, sideways or whatever, as soon as I put on the tripod, it's still in sports mode, but it will only detect if there's very small variation. If I'm not touching the camera, VR is not activated. This is something that a lot of people don't realize. They'll say that as soon as you put the lens on tripod, disconnect VR. Well, that is not the case. You can Google it yourself and you'll see, like I've been able to research, and I found that this is true from Nikon, that they state that the 200-500 is tripod aware. It doesn't degrade your images, the sharpness, so I just leave it on. Now, should we use VR in normal mode or in sports mode? This is the big conundrum. A lot of people say, well, you should just use it in normal mode. If you follow my channel, you know that I suffer from very shaky hands. And this is why I also showed photos on the tripod, because these days I'm very hard hand holding my camera. I find that I get the shakes. And as you saw, when I'm hand holding, whether it was normal or sports mode, the camera is just going everywhere. That's not the VR doing it. That's me. I just find it so hard with my shaky hands. This is why I've just bought a carbon fiber tripod, and my camera now is fixed to this carbon fiber tripod whenever I go out. Let's take a look at some comparison photos to show you the difference between no VR, VR normal, and VR sports for clarity and sharpness of photos. So these three sample photos were taken on the tripod. You can see it says 1/4000th of a second, no VR. I was just using a fruit box because trying to get a bird for this example stationary all the time was just not on. So I decided to use this fruit box set at around 15 meters away from me. The text is very clear, 1/4000th of a second, no VR. But look at this, 1/500th of a second, VR normal. The consensus is on Google, and a lot of photographers will state that you should have VR off. Well, VR on normal, I have the same clarity, the same sharpness. And what about VR sports? It is the same. I can hardly find any difference at all between these three examples. I would have to be very nitpicky if I'm trying to find the difference. Now, let's see the difference hand holding. So this is 1/1400th of a second, handheld, no VR. 1/500th of a second, VR normal. Just as sharp as the one without VR. And what about sports? Exactly the same. I have found no difference. Hand holding, whether I'm using no VR, whether I'm using VR normal, or whether I'm using VR sports. And when it's on the tripod, I'm getting the same clarity, whether there's no VR, whether there's VR normal, or whether it's VR sports. But what I found is that when I'm using VR, even if it's on the tripod, that my point of focus is staying exactly where it is. I hope this helps you understand now that You don't have to be scared of losing sharpness if you're using VR. Does it matter if we lose a couple of frames per second? But we have sharp images and we lock onto our target. You saw when I was hand holding. Imagine that I was photographing this little wren and I was trying to take photos and the camera is just jumping around. And it's not the camera, it's me. I'm just jumping around because I'm finding it hard holding this, that I would be wasting so many good shots. So use VR. Be confident that if you're using this kit, you're going to get great photos with VR, whether hand holding, whether on a monopod, or whether on a tripod. So thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, give me a big thumbs up and I'll see you next time.